So though this presentation may not be the sexiest or the most fun, I think why it's really important is because in this realm of becoming more patient-centric with our patients and vendors and pharma, trying to incorporate the voice of the patient into what we do in pharma, one of the small things that we tend to overlook is really making the materials as patient-friendly as possible. So if a patient gets a list of and a packet of materials about a clinical research study and they look at them, sometimes it can be like Greek to them and it can just be overwhelming and really unclear. And for those of us in industry that are trying to change the way that we operate in clinical research, overcoming a lot of the legal and compliance obstacles can be kind of feel really overwhelming and kind of like boiling the ocean. So hopefully the information that you find in my presentation today are kind of these little quick wins that you can maybe implement as soon as tomorrow. Oh, I don't have an agenda, but we'll make it through, it's okay. You know, a lot of people kind of have that impression of like the big bad pharma, and you know, and Merck is definitely one of the biggest pharma companies that are out there. But what I think is really telling is that Merck has incorporated health literacy into its corporate responsibility report. And this report really goes into like kind of the principles of where we drive, where we're going as a business and as a company. So if you look at one of our quotes around this, health literacy is really vital to achieving the best possible results. And I'm going to skip down to where it says we must partner with patients to promote understanding of their medical condition or disease, the reasons they're being treated, and the appropriate use of medications and other treatments. And then this will result in maximizing the benefit and minimizing issues when using our medicines. And it goes on to say that we're committed to this. This isn't just corporate speak, and I can attest to the fact that there is a movement going on in our company. It's a small one, but it usually starts with one person, and it starts to grow. So really defining health literacy, you might say, what is this? Well, health literacy is really the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services, to make appropriate healthcare decisions, and also access services and navigate the healthcare system. And I think that last point is really important around the navigation of the healthcare system. And for those of you that have been a patient advocate for a parent, such as me, or a child or yourself, really navigating that healthcare system is really overwhelming and a lot of times really difficult to do. So again, why is it so important? Again, it can affect a person's ability to access healthcare services, use those services appropriately, knowing that they're out there, adopt health promoting behaviors, how to take care of their health, manage chronic conditions, navigate the healthcare system, and then act on health related news and information. So things that you see on the internet, on the web, out there. So we also know that it's interesting because poor health literacy is a stronger predictor of a person's health than age, income, employment status, education level, and race. And that's huge. It's a really huge point that we have to take into consideration when we're thinking about promoting health literacy in the pharmaceutical industry, as well as benefiting our patients the best way we can. So some examples of health literacy in action, understanding and taking medication on a schedule. So what has used to be happening a lot of times in pharma is we were creating these labels and patients weren't really able to understand how they were supposed to be taking their medication. And we actually had, we had some labeling, reform going on where patients were, almost were in tears saying that they could finally understand how to take their medication, which was huge. Also explaining a new diagnosis and care instructions. Again, for some of these conditions that you may have never heard of, or if you have yourself, a loved one, your child, really, getting hit with a diagnosis can really be overwhelming, and being able to really understand that on top of all the emotions that come along with the diagnosis is really important. And lastly, designing information and science to help people navigate. And I know this kind of seems a little trite, but in a hospital, some of these huge complexes, I know in Philly, where I'm located, some of the bigger medical centers, navigating where to go after you have to go get an x-ray or you have to go get an MRI, finding that location, and you have an oncologist in that same hospital, finding that, sometimes it's not the easiest way to navigate either. So that is kind of part of health literacy also. The Obama administration has actually had implemented the Clean Writing Act of 2010. So in this, federal documents must be written so that the public can understand them. And what's been interesting is companies have started to adopt this in the larger infrastructure of our business. So now public documents must better explain benefits and services of who is eligible. So why you may think that this is really easy to implement, it's back in 2010 and it's 2017 almost. And still this is really just starting to get out there more and more. So one example of the Plain Writing Act that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with is the way that labels are now done. So if you see on the left was an existing label prior to the Plain Writing Act and then after. So as you can see on the right, it's a lot more clear. You can see what the active ingredients are, the directions are really clear, the warnings are really clear, and the facts are really clear. So again, just one of those really simple things that it just is kind of a no-brainer. Like, make it short, sweet, understandable, and it's better for everybody. So plain language is just one important way and one important tool to help improve health literacy. And I will just say openly that there are a lot of different ways that you can help improve health literacy, and we're just going to cover plain language today because I have such a short amount of time. I could go on and talk about this for a long time. So really, plain language isn't writing so that everyone can understand. It's writing so that your intended readers can understand. And the key point here is really thinking about who your audience and who your purpose is. So using plain language to improve communication to patients. So some of the principles that we follow are using words that people can understand the first time that they read them, so they don't have to take them and then take them home and look it up on Google or somewhere else to really study to find out what that doctor meant or what that piece of information meant. Organize the information so the most important points come first. Use simple language, avoid jargon. I'll get into some examples of what is jargon and what we might not think is jargon and it actually is, and finding medical terms. And then lastly, using active voice, conversational style, and short sentences, which again are pretty simple things that you can implement. So writing with plain language principles really helps patients find what they need, understand what they find, and then act on that understanding. So again, it's a very clear, easy way to help improve the process through which patients get information. And we also know that plain language can help improve the understanding of materials, handouts, forms, everything that we work with in the healthcare system, as well as applications. Reduce the need for customers to seek clarification because they're confused. And a lot of times when people are confused, sometimes they just give up on it and they don't want to do it, and things don't get filled out, and really it promotes this inactivity for getting things done. And then lastly, it reduces the number of errors that are made and the time and effort correcting them. And that's another big point in this system. So this is just an example of using plain language communication to patients. And I had this on two different, kind of like a fly-in, but so before the example is, I understand the authorized healthcare providers / organizations and professionals that receive or access healthcare information about the pursuant this authorization may redisclose this information to healthcare providers, organizations, not participating. It just goes on. So what we can do is really simplify using health literacy principles to simplify it. So after you take that big bunch of jargon, and it's important, we have to have that in there, but cutting it down to, I understand that those who receive my healthcare information may give this information to others who are not involved in my care. And I'll get into some of the myths and facts around health literacy, because a lot of times, especially as industry and as pharma, we tend to over-communicate because we think it's going to give us the safety net. Like, if I over-communicate, then I can say that I covered everything and everything's in there. But what you're doing is confusing people. If anything, you might be exposing yourself to more liability. So we really have to think through how to better communicate in a more simple and effective way. So some key elements of developing plain language content and patient materials. There's 5 areas that I'm going to cover rather quickly. Audience and purpose, scope and structure, content, behavior and interactivity, and lastly, design. So when we're thinking about developing materials for our patients and making them more health literate and patient friendly, some questions to ask, and this is a guide, and you'll have all these slides after the meeting. And I know the slides are hard to read for the cheap seats in the back, so again, I'll point into these after the meeting, but I'll read them to you. So really the main purpose here is really, you want to think about what this material is for. Is it to inform? Is it to educate? Is it an awareness? It's really this idea of trying to plan ahead, thinking about your objective and who is the intended audience. Thinking about your audience. Are they in a specific age bracket, race, ethnicity, geographic area? Sometimes we have to really tailor those materials to that different demographic. Do they have specific needs we should address, such as low literacy, vision impairment, cultural differences? So again, we tend to think in this one size fits all, and though we can't make a brochure or a piece of material for every single patient, every demographic. We can be better about incorporating cultural diversity and really targeting our audience for who we're trying to address. Next, how does this document appear to our audience? When a person sees it and they pick it up or they read it, how are they approached with it? What do they think when they first see it? What does the writer want the reader to get from this document? What are we intending to do? What is the action that we're expecting? What does the reader want to get from this document? Are they looking to take actions from it? Are they just looking to get informed? How can the document better reflect what the audience needs? And then how can we make it clear at first glance? For audience and purpose in clinical trials, when we're thinking about our audience, we have to really think about, first and foremost, our patients. Patients considering taking part in a clinical trial are dealing with a lot of different things. They're hoping that this treatment may cure them or treat them more effectively than the current standard of care. Also, patients or caregivers looking for clinical trials may have worry, stress, concerns, trouble reading or processing the information, and no experience with research. So this is a real-life example. This piece of material was developed in our research department, but really if you look at that cover sheet of that brochure, it says clinical research studies, what you need to know. Who's you? Is it the doctor? Is it the patient? Is it the caregiver of that patient? We don't know. Is the purpose clear? What you need to know about participating, about other studies that were done, it's just really not clear. So when we were going back and looking at real-life case examples of how we were developing materials, I sat there with my hand in my head and I was just thinking, oh my gosh, we've developed all these materials over the years without these things in mind. What do we do? And what you do is you stop, you correct, you move on. And then when we're heading into thinking about scope, it's really thinking about all the information that you're talking about in your piece of material related to the purpose. What information do you need to know? Again, it's this idea of we over-communicate. So really trying to limit the content to the need-to-know information rather than the nice-to-know. And again, I'm guilty of communicating the nice-to-know. Like, oh, they might want to have this for later, so let's put it in there. And really trying to make sure that we kind of streamline and don't over stress somebody with a new indication or a new diagnosis about too much information. And then some simple questions to ask yourself: does this document avoid using too much background information? Does it use a positive focus? I think that's another key piece of information that we have to focus on as well. Does it give specific concrete steps? Use examples and visuals to emphasize, and I think that's another big piece, is using visuals to really communicate our points. Again, we talk in statistics a lot, and utilizing pictures rather than words I think is a great way to go about doing that. And then last is explaining the benefits and risks. And I know through a lot of work with the FDA that they've come out and really have changed that risk-benefit to benefit-risk to kind of change the way that we even perceive clinical trials and put the best foot forward first, because we do want to stress the benefits of our clinical trials for our patients. Next is around the importance of the outline, so really around the clinical research brochure, establishing who the document's for and what they need from the audience and what they need from them, making a list of information, figuring out the items that are related and label them to be chunked together or pieced together. Sometimes we have a tendency to put information all over the place. Identify your most important piece of information and make that your first section. Think about which chunk of information is important to understand or acting on, put that next, and then repeat that process until you find a chunk that's not so important, and then you kind of start to think and realize what things are out of scope for your document. Next, thinking about the structure of your document and questions to ask and how well is the information organized. Again, it's this idea of putting the most important information first, relating and putting the items that are related together. Is there a logical order of information? And then lastly, does the document have a clear heading and subheadings? And this is just an example of a way that you can structure a document. And this is an actual, again, clinical research brochure, facts about asthma in children. It talks about, first thing is what is asthma? And the next one is about what is a placebo, and it kind of gives a clear heading and then some information under that. The next section is around content, and content is, again, thinking about the words that you're utilizing in your material. Is there jargon? Does the document use common words and define jargon where needed? Does it use terms consistently? Is it specific? Limit acronyms? And avoid categories or classes of information. And I know in some of these bigger indications, we tend to overuse the acronyms and the use of acronyms, so that's another area that I think in the medical terminology need to be a little bit better on. Sentences, make sure they're in active voice, avoid extra words, make sure those sentences are direct, and use second person, and doesn't use contractions. So the next point is around medical jargon, and this is a little interesting to me when I first saw it. For example, manage, risk, lifestyle, referral. You wouldn't think, straight off the bat that these are necessarily jargon, but we were looking through a lot of the research and work with the FDA and work with some of our health literacy partners. These are actually words that are more commonly used, but they shouldn't be used because they are jargon. This is just a content example, and I just did a little exercise for, can you recognize the jargon? The highlighted words are the words that are jargon. And as you can see, this is a very simple, very straightforward, as we think, the way that we develop our clinical research brochures and our enrollment support materials for patients. And kind of like eligibility criteria is just kind of like a no-brainer when we talk about if a person is eligible for a clinical research trial. There are ways to utilize other words to describe this to make it more health literate and patient-friendly. Next is just an example of showing you clear headings. The next area is around behavior and interactivity, keeping these questions in mind when you're developing your materials as well. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but really thinking about if your document or your patient materials does it need to have action items, do they start with verbs, really getting into if there are any specific concrete behavioral actions that you need your audience to take. And then what the research has found is in a lot of these indications, making a document more interactive, like having an area for patients to write things down, take notes, things for them to ask their doctor, are really useful for patients as well. And then lastly is the area of design. Do the headings make visual hierarchy easy to see? Is the text high contrast with a good size and type? Is there enough white space in the document? A lot of times we want to jam so much information into a document that there's a very little white space in between sentences that people can't read it very well. Justification is another area that we need to be kind of wise about when we're thinking about design. Does the document limit all caps, italics, underlining, and paragraphs of bold? So it's important to kind of limit the use of that as well. Also limiting the use of parentheses, hyphens, slashes, and quotation marks is also another key point there. What the research has shown too is that when you put things in parentheses, not necessarily because of an acronym, but if you're referring to something and then you put something in parentheses, the tendency for a lot of populations is to skip entirely over that whatever's in parentheses. So that is a tip that I learned as well. And also, are there ways to vary the format to make it more interesting and engaging for the reader? And we always want to think of ways to do that. So here are some design layout tips for font. Use a clean, clear typeface, 12 to 14 font in size. Serif and sans serif are the two fonts that are most commonly known to be the most health and patient friendly. Use upper and lowercase letters, never all caps. It's kind of the shouting, like in an email, you would never write, like, get this email back to me now. Using white space, as I mentioned before, is really important. Avoiding full justification. Emphasizing important information with bulleted lists, underlining, and bold. Use color carefully to highlight, add clarity, differentiate, or focus the eye, and then using shading boxes and arrows to direct attention. And I think these are all easy steps there. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Merck's standardized approach to health literacy. So we try to integrate our health literacy principles into the design of our patient health materials, including but not limited to following the following steps. Identifying the target audience, again, knowing their needs, interests, and behaviors, defining the purpose and objectives in the cover title, the cover illustration, and introduction. Limiting the scope of the content, including need-to-know information, not nice-to-know. Focus on concrete behavior, skills, and instructions. Ensuring that reading level is appropriate and allows as many people as possible to read and understand the materials. And I think that's a very, very important point. A lot of materials that we have are written at the 10th grade level or above, and where it should be is somewhere around the 6th when we're thinking about health literacy and those kinds of materials. Right, using plain language, conversational style, active voice, simple sentences, short lists, explanations of technical terms, and data that are easy to understand. Again, the use of visuals and graphs is a lot easier to interpret than words or the way that fractions are commonly put out there. Again, the use of graphics that are friendly, relevant, action-oriented, and reinforce objectives, and again, addressing that audience and making sure that they're the most appropriate for that audience. And then last is translating high-quality translation services, which I think is really important for our global materials as well. So our process at Merck, and again, for a company that's pretty conservative in the way that we produce our materials, we're very conscious about how the materials look to the outside audience. So our process is that we draft materials within clinical operations, my group. Then we have a subject matter expert in health literacy, which is usually myself or a couple of my colleagues, or we have a health literacy vendor that we work with that will almost like proof that material or redesign that material. Then we have our clinical team review and approve that. We have our legal department look over it, and then we shove that off to our IRB or ERC for approval. So it's a pretty simple process. I would say one of the biggest things is probably the legal review for a lot of you out there. That may be a little burdensome. So you might be sitting here thinking, that'd be a nice idea, but I have some concerns. How will my materials lose meaning if they're shorter, less detailed? And I think this is a concern that comes primarily from our medical staff and our clinical directors, that they want to over-educate or over-inform about the study itself. How much effort or work does it take? It does sound like a lot. Will my legal department or ethics committee agree with this strategy? So I want to just lastly provide a few myths and facts. So the first is around, the first myth is changing the language will not be precise enough. It will lose meaning. It may lose meaning. Again, this is usually a concern that comes up from the medical or clinical staff. But in fact, writing in a health literate way is bound to improve precision. Doing so often reveals unclear and unnecessary content. And it's being done all over the world with very successful results. Next, rewriting resources in a health literate way will take too much effort. It will take some effort, and I think it's a way that, it's kind of like training a muscle, like the more that you do it, the easier it gets. But it does help patient communication switch from a disease focus to a patient focus, and I think this is the way that we want to move eventually. The CDC promotes plain language as one effective strategy for increasing the medication adherence. So, this is really being done all across, not just the pharmaceutical industry, but also, the government industry as well. And then last, health literacy may put us at risk for legal problems, and this was one of my biggest concerns, where the fact here is that writing with health literacy principles in mind doesn't actually contribute to medical or regulatory negligence. It actually protects us by ensuring that we're clearly communicating to our patients. And in fact, many studies have shown that high reading levels prevent understanding, which can actually increase legal liability. So I just wanted to provide that information to you. Throughout the presentation, I have notated where we found our information. So if you want to, go and you're trying to, reinforce this to your own legal staff, that's there for you. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.